Good morning. I'm Susan Murray, Director of the David Hume Institute, and I am delighted to welcome you to the discussion this morning of the latest results of the Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker. It's a quarterly survey of over 2,000 people in Scotland, which we undertake every 3 months with the DFLE partnership. The survey aims to increase understanding of the interactions between people and the economy. And a huge thank you to the Royal Bank of Scotland for hosting us today in this lovely building and for the wonderful breakfast we've all just enjoyed. This morning, Scott Edgar, the Senior Research Manager with the DFLE Partnership, will present the latest findings from the tracker and give us insights into the economic confidence and behaviours over time. We'll then reflect on the findings. We're joined by João Sousa, Deputy Director of the Fraser Allender Institute, and Sebastian Burnside from the NatWest Group. João leads the Fraser Allender's economic analysis of fiscal issues. Prior to this, he was a senior fiscal analyst with the OBR, and he led on analysis of long-term sustainability of the UK's public finances and on the effect of fiscal policy on the UK's medium-term outlook. He has a BSc in economics from the University of Porto, a master's degree in economic policy from University College London, and is in the final stages of his PhD in economics on fiscal policy at Birkbeck University of London. Wow, quite a collection of qualifications there. Sebastian Burnside is the Chief Economist at the NatWest Group. He joined the Royal Bank of Scotland in 2009 and has been Chief Economist for the NatWest Group since 2018. His insights help the bank understand how we need to change to meet the demands of an evolving economy, and his analysis covers a wide range of topics reflecting on personal and corporate customers. The topics affecting personal and corporate customers, from the demographic change and student debt to macro-prudential and monetary policy. Before joining RBS, Sebastian worked as an economist for Ofcom and PwC, and he holds degrees in economics from the London School of Economics and the University of Edinburgh. So, without any further ado, we will crack on and hand over to Scott.
Good morning, everybody. So, as Susan says, today we're going to run through findings from Wave 11 of the Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker. So, a bit of background on the Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker. We've been running this since September 2021. Sometimes we ask the same questions, sometimes we ask slightly different ones, but what we now have is a long time series of public attitudes, priorities, and economic outlooks. So, I'm going to spend the next 10 or 15 minutes or so just running through that with you this morning. So, as Susan mentioned, it's a quarterly survey of over 2,000 people in Scotland. Fieldwork took place about 4 weeks ago, between the 2nd to 7th of May. Now, around that time was not long after the First Minister at the time, Humza Yousaf, had announced his resignation, and around the time that John Swinney had basically confirmed his candidacy to be First Minister. And now, doesn't that feel like a very long time ago, even though it was only 4 weeks ago? So part of what we'll look at today is that public priorities that people will be discussing in the lead up to the election on the 4th of July. So one of the questions that we regularly ask on the tracker is a very broad question about whether people feel that Scotland is heading in the right or wrong direction. And now we're at a stage where we're finding that over 3 in 5 think that Scotland is heading in the wrong direction. So in the latest wave of the tracker, 62% of people said they believe Scotland to be heading in the wrong direction. And what you can see quite clearly from this chart is that that's the highest that we've had on record over the course of the tracker. Equally, the proportion saying they believe that Scotland is heading in the right direction is down at 19%, tied with the proportion of people who say that they don't know. Now, if you cast your eye way back to the start of the tracker, you can see that they were basically neck and neck with a sort of short lift up to positivity as we were coming out of the pandemic. But then since then, the trajectory's been pretty clear. And over the last year or so, we've seen that figure increase. This is a figure that we watch quite carefully because even though it's a very broad and wide question about the idea of right and wrong direction, what it does give us is a sense of how people in the country are feeling overall. And at the minute, we're at kind of the lowest sense of negativity highest sense of negativity rather, that we've seen over the course of the series. There are some slight differences in terms of how different demographics feel about this. So older participants are more likely to think that Scotland's heading in the wrong direction than younger. But it's interesting that that's held firm over the series. So as that's happened, it's continuously as the gaps widened, those demographic differences have kind of solidified and continued in each wave. And then we also ask people what their priorities are. So this question here asks people to name their top 3 priorities facing Scotland today. And what we can see from this is that over the course of the series, healthcare and the NHS and the cost of living and inflation have pulled away as the 2 key issues that people in Scotland identify as top issues facing the country. So healthcare and the NHS, now about just over half of Scots are saying healthcare and the NHS is amongst their top priorities. And 2 in 5 say that the cost of living / inflation is in their top priorities. So as we look ahead to a general election on the 4th of July, it's quite clear that these are the 2 priority areas that people in the country are looking at. But what is also interesting is if you look at this, if you look at this kind of gathering in the middle, they're very, very close, up about 15% and 20%. What we see is the same issues there are kind of coalesced around that figure and are continuously around between kind of 15 and 20%, and those include poverty and inequality, trust in politics, interestingly, the economy and housing. Now, what you won't see on that chart, because it's kind of cut off to be being at above 10%, is the constitution and devolution, which we now find that only 7% of people are saying is amongst their top 3 priorities, and that's the lowest that we've got on record. In fact, when we first did this in September 2021, 25% of people named it amongst their top 3 priorities. So what we've seen over the course of the series is that that's went down in its salience, but issues related to cost of living and healthcare in particular have pulled away. And again, we see some interesting differences in demographics within that. So issues like the cost of living and poverty and inequality are more likely to be identified as top issues amongst younger respondents and women. And then issues related to the healthcare and the NHS are more likely to be identified by older participants as important, relatively speaking, though the figure is still quite high amongst younger participants as well. It's always interesting to think of these seasonally too. So if we look at the environment and climate change, that's down about 11% in this wave of the research. However, if we cast our minds back to last August, it was about 18%, and we see that figure tends to change with events. So at the start of the series, it was about the time of COP26. Everybody was talking about the environment, everyone was talking about climate change, and it was a bit higher. Last summer, when there was the wildfires across Europe, it was up at 18%, but since then it's tapered off. So it's always interesting to think of these priorities in alignment with events that are taking place wider. So in addition to just priorities in general, we also ask about economic priorities, and we've been doing this for maybe the last 8 or 9 waves actually. And what we see here is that cost of living and inflation is the top economic priority named by Scots. So that's up at 6 and 10, followed by living standards and wages and spending on public services. Actually, these have remained quite steady over recent waves in particular. So you can see the figures that are the change on the outside of the charts. You can see there's not a lot of variation in there, which suggests that these figures of this prioritisation for economic issues has become quite firm. And this is what people, are prioritising consistently. Again, there's some interesting demographic differences in here. Cost of living is a bigger issue relatively to those aged 16 to 34. That's up at 7 and 10. It's down at less than half for those at 65 plus at 47%. So we can see there's a difference in the figure depending on the demographics. And again, there's interesting differences in terms of gender. So economic growth, men are more likely to talk about economic growth as a top economic concern. Women are more likely to talk about poverty as a top economic concern. So we can see there's a difference in there, and if anyone wants to see the tables, they're more than welcome to pore over them and see what the interesting differences are. There's plenty of them. Another thing that we ask people is for their economic outlook. So that looks both forward and back. So the last 12 months and the next 12 months. And we do 2 different things. So we ask about general economic conditions. Do you think they've improved or declined over the last 12 months? And do you think they'll improve or decline over the next 12? And then their own personal financial circumstances. And what we consistently find is that people are more likely to be negative about general economic conditions than they are about their own personal conditions. Now, we've got the headline here, pessimism on the decline. It is still fairly pessimistic, but what we're finding over time is actually that is declining. In the next chart that I show illustrates that a little bit better. But what you see here is that 2/3 of people believe that general economic conditions have got worse over the last 12 months, and 45% think that their own financial circumstances have got worse over the last 12 months. And there's been slight increases in positivity in terms of now 14% think that their personal circumstances are better than 12 months ago. That was at 12% in February. And now 10% think that general economic circumstances are better than 12 months ago, and that was at 6% in February. When people look to the future, still 6 in 10 think that general economic conditions will get worse in the next 12 months. 2 in 5 think that their personal circumstances will get worse in the next 12 months. So as we can see, sort of a general sense of negativity, but as I mentioned, this next graph shows us a little bit better. So what this graph here shows is basically net scores. So if you take away the positive minus the negative, it shows you where you are in terms of net positivity. Now, what's important about the axis is that they're all negative, so it's actually starting at 0%. But what you can see is there's been a kind of slow march over the last few waves of some kind of slow progress towards some feeling of positivity. Well, largely still negative, but more positive than it was before. People who've been to these presentations before will have heard this kind of, it's kind of pessimistic, but a wee bit more optimistic over time. But as you can see, that's happening and it's carrying forward. So the top, as I mentioned, the bottom two bars, the one at minus 54% and minus 42% are about general economic conditions, and then the two that are slightly more positive are about personal financial circumstances. So what you can see is there's slight improvements in terms of people's outlook, but still overall negative. And another question that we've been asking since May 2022 is what kind of behaviours Scots have been taking to respond to rising prices and inflation and the cost of living crisis. And what we see here is kind of a remarkable stability, but what we see is that 2/3 say they're cutting down on non-essential purchases, just about over 6 in 10 are saying they're cutting on their energy use and heating, and 58% cutting on their leisure activities. But in between waves this time, we've seen kind of small changes in this, which shows that these behaviours are, I'd say, pretty much like baked in. And if you look at demographics as well, younger people are more likely to be using all of these avenues that are available to them than older people. So it's an interesting kind of reflection on what people are doing. There have been some changes, interesting changes between the two last waves. So the proportion who say that they're losing sleep because of their finances has gone down by 4 percentage points, but it still remains 1 in 4 who are reflecting that's what's happening to them. Leisure activities as well, it still remains high, but we've seen a kind of a drop of 4 percentage points since the last wave, suggesting perhaps that some people are now no longer cutting down on their leisure activities as much as they were before. And reducing donations to charity, which is an interesting one, which kind of bounces around a little bit. We've seen a 3 percentage point increase in the proportion of people who say that they've done that. So I think what's interesting is perhaps how maybe people are prioritising these different things that they can do. And then we asked people about their satisfaction with their income. And what we found here is that 1/3 of people report being satisfied with their income. That's down from 37% in November when we last asked it. Income covering the cost of living, around 3 in 10, 27% are saying that they're satisfied with that. That's actually down also from the last wave where it was slightly higher at 31%. And ability to meet bills, 2 in 5 say that they're satisfied with that. Again, that's down slightly from the last wave in November where it was at 43%. Again, we can look at this in terms of nets, so taking the satisfaction and the dissatisfaction away from each other. And what we see here is that there was a kind of positive trajectory over the last few waves that's kind of rebounded slightly. So in November, people were slightly more satisfied with their income covering the cost of living. They were slightly more satisfied with the balance between unpaid commitments, but that's actually come down a little bit in the latest wave, which is interesting to sort of try and digest when you look at the kind of more positivity generally between November and March. And I'd be eager to hear any kind of thoughts and reflections people have on why that might be the case. And then we asked a couple of new questions about financial well-being and employer benefits. And what we found with this is that 54% of people reported that their financial well-being is worse than it was this time last year. And that was higher amongst women than it was amongst men. So 57% of women, said that their financial well-being was worse than this time last year, compared to half of men. 37% said that, 38% said that, 31% said it was unchanged on last year, and 14% reported it was better. But overall, what we see is a picture in terms of financial well-being as one where people are saying that their financial well-being is worse than it was this time last year. But we also asked about the impacts of that. So we asked people what impacts concerns over money matters had on them in the last 12 months. And what we find is that 37% reported having a detrimental impact on their mental health. That's sharper in the most deprived communities. People in SIMD 1 to 3 are more likely to report that. We have 35% saying that they've lost sleep at some point in the last 12 months as a result of money matters. 22% saying it's had a negative impact on their home relationships, and 47% reporting that none of the above impacts none of the above had happened to them as a result of concerns over money matters. What's interesting here is we then see the impact that concern over money matters then has on individuals and their health and well-being, and this helps to show that. And my final slide on the findings is we also asked people about employer benefits. So apart from increasing your pay, what would be the kind of things you'd like to see introduced, in order to help you with your finances? And what we see as the top one was introducing or improving staff benefits to protect you and your family. That could include sickness pay, insurance, things like that. 29% said benefits to reduce fuel and energy costs would be something that they would be interested in an employer thinking about. 28% report help with travel costs, something they'd be interested in their employer helping with, and 23% help with to help with the cost of essential items. But only 20% of the people who responded saying that they were happy with their overall benefits package, which is always an interesting thing to reflect on, in the sense that if you give people the option to pick, it's interesting that they're going to say they're going to pick things, but I think it is interesting to see what the hierarchy of those things is that comes out when people are given the opportunity to do so. So that was my whistle-stop tour through the findings of it from the latest wave of the Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker. Thank you very much, everybody, for your attention. Looking forward to the discussion and take your questions.
Thanks, Scott. Good morning, everyone. Some really, really interesting stuff from the tracker that we just heard about. I think I will focus on a couple of things that I think are more in my area of expertise, as you have heard about as well. One of them is the fact, just the reflection that there are two main things that people care about broadly, and then the other ones are kind of bumbling along the 10 to 20% level. So the healthcare and the NHS, and then the cost of living and inflation are by far the things that matter the most to people. And that's probably something that you're going to see reflected in the general election campaign that we're going to see in the next few weeks as well. I thought it was really interesting that the cost of living and the economy, they're separate. And maybe I'm misinterpreting this, but I kind of see it as one is kind of personal, the cost of living, what you have to do to make ends meet, and how you're being affected by things. And the economy tends to be much broader. And it's really interesting that not only do people feel relatively pessimistic about the economy in general, much more than about their own financial situation, but also that they care about it much less than they do about their personal circumstances, which is not surprising. But when you hear some of the commentary about the current economic situation and the fact that inflation has come down quite significantly from its peak of over 12%, from the fact that the economy is out of recession, I wonder to what extent that really, first of all, whether that matters to people that much, because it seems like it might not. If they're not seeing it in their own personal circumstances, then maybe that's not something that people want to be hearing about that much. And the other thing is they might not feel that particularly being relevant to them. And so that kind of tracks to some extent with the fact that, and Scott, you talked about the dissatisfaction with level of income, and people feel a lot more than half of people feeling like they are worse off than last year. I think I did some calculations yesterday. Unfortunately, the ONS is still having some trouble with Scottish labour force statistics. So this is on a Great Britain basis. But the price level is up 19.5% since July 2021. Average pay is only up 17.3%. So people's real wages are still down compared to where they were just after the end of lockdowns. So it's perhaps unsurprising that people aren't feeling better off, because they're not better off. And it's 3 years ago. Normally we'd expect the economy to be growing over time, and in 3 years you might expect people's real wages to be up, I don't know, 3%, something like that. And they're not. They're over 2% down. So that's a 5% swing, and it makes a huge amount of difference. The other thing that is noteworthy, and we're probably going to hear a lot about, is healthcare. Now, that reflects a lot of things, but one of the things it does reflect is the fact that the waiting list is continuing to be a problem. So there's about, I think, 700,000 appointments on the waiting list at the moment in Scotland. It's not as easy as saying, there's 700,000 people, because some people will appear more than once on the waiting list because they're waiting for more than one thing. But I think it's probably safe to say that most Scots know someone relatively close who is on the waiting list. And that's probably not unrelated to the fact that people are saying that it is their top priority. Now, is this going to change? There's been a lot of discussions as to whether more money is necessary for the health service or not. The noises, and I should say, obviously, the Scottish Government has got some powers to try and raise more money, but ultimately the biggest component of its health budget, and all of its budget really, is the block grant, and that is driven by what the Treasury does. And so it's really important to not only pay attention to what the Scottish Government is doing, but also to what the current and potential future Chancellor and Health Secretary in England are saying, because what they do has consequences for the funding that Scotland has available. And all the noises seem to be that there isn't going to be that much more if a new government comes into power. There might be something on the waiting list. That could be something that isn't being talked about that much, because it might have minor consequentials in the short run. But ultimately, the fiscal rules that Rachel Reeves is talking about are pretty much the same rules that Jeremy Hunt is using. So we shouldn't be surprised if the direction of travel either way in terms of fiscal policy isn't that different. The other thing that I should mention on this is that a lot of what Jeremy Hunt has been talking about in the last couple of years, and the Labour Party as well have been talking about, is getting people into work and increasing the labour supply by basically targeting people who have long-term conditions and who might not be able to work, but could if they had either some support or if they actually managed to get the treatment that they require. Now, it'll be interesting to see whether there are any new ideas coming up in the next few weeks as to how they might do that, because that is a substantial number of people that could improve economic conditions if they could work longer than they are working at the moment. So I would keep my eyes peeled to see if there's any ideas coming up from the current and shadow Work and Pensions Secretary as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jao. Thank you, Scott. Good morning and welcome, everybody. So I'd like to offer a couple of reflections and then share a few insights from what we're seeing amongst our customers' behaviour at the Royal Bank of Scotland, both on the personal and the business side, and see how that relates into the data that we've just been shared. First of all, a really helpful immediate reflection that whilst we have seen some of the aggregate measures move into more positive territory, wage growth being above the growth in prices, that is one, a crude average across the whole of the economy, and there are very many different personal sets of wage rates and prices that people face, and therefore I think that diversity came through very strongly in the data. As well as this idea of a lag. Jao mentioned there've been if you take the clock back many years, we are still trying to undo some of the damage that we all took to our standards of living when, in particular, food and fuel prices went through the roof the first time. So lagged effects on that side clearly still affecting sentiment. We do still have, however, some positive hangovers from this particularly tumultuous economic period we've been through. One of the most significant coming out of COVID was the amount of deposits, cash, current accounts and savings that were built up when you were literally not allowed to spend your money during lockdown. And that has been a tailwind to some of the catch-up growth that we see. And we've seen the relative scale of those cash reserves amongst customers fall in relation to the prices and cost of living. But buried in the distribution is quite an interesting quirk. Because we do worry about Scotland and the UK and the number of people who have, for example, enough money to be able to meet an immediate level of expense. Your car breaks down, you need £600 to do something else like that. And a consistent finding from our own customers' data and from survey evidence across the whole market is that there are now a higher share of people with access to at least some modest amount of financial support, be it savings or some other backdrop. So that is a theme which has supported us and has been, I think, been very powerful tool through which people have managed this big impact on their living standards and allowed them to smooth their spending somewhat. We're also seeing, from a kind of food and fuel poverty perspective, some reductions, still at high levels, but some reductions in the share of customers that we would estimate being in food or fuel poverty, having typically less than 15% and more. Those expenditure categories accounting for typically more than 15% of their incomes. And that's been driven by both sides of that equation. Income growth at the top line, at the bottom line, sorry, and absolute reductions in the amount that people are spending, in particular on the energy component now, with the price gap coming down. We've just seen another one of those reductions, and I believe the analysts are expecting another to come in about 3 months' time. So whilst slow and steady, those do have measurable impacts on some of the people who are most acutely affected by this squeeze that we've been through. And then thirdly, on reflection on behaviour and what we can see, some of the people who've faced the biggest changes in financial circumstances over the last couple of years have been those people who've remortgaged into a radically higher interest rate environment. Typically, that has cost customers around £180 a month extra on top of their bills. So is a real big hurdle to get over. What we've seen in analysing the financial behaviour of those people who have been in that situation is they've used every kind of tool in their toolbox in order to adapt to that new financial reality. So we've seen modest increases in income flowing into our accounts, often from kind of other sources. Hard to narrow down exactly where that's coming from, but fits with themes of greater use of renting out rooms, and selling things on various platforms that now exist to take a photo of your materials and put it in the post. And greater creativity with how they're managing their financial flows from that side. Back to savings. For the roughly 1/5 of mortgages who have considerable amount of savings, so around kind of £20,000 or more, those customers have been drawing down, if you like, on those stocks to a greater extent than their peers who haven't been through a remortgaging process, and are using that buffer to help them meet the increased monthly amount. Clearly, that's not an option which most borrowers have, but some very much do and are using it very sensibly. And then thirdly, the biggest source of adjustment has come from those spending behaviours. So we see absolute reductions in monthly spend going out through accounts from people who have remortgaged. As the monetary policy textbooks and Bank of England would expect, that's how it's supposed to happen. But you can see that. And we can also see some twists in customer behaviour, which will chime with lots of business customers and their behaviour. Amongst the groceries and the supermarkets, we can see marginally more spending relatively taking place in venues which have greater perception of value. So the discounters, Lidl and Morrison's doing well, versus more premium outlets. So we see relatively less spend going through Waitrose and Marks and Spencer's from those people who remortgaged over the course of the last 12 months versus those who haven't. So in absolute sense, people spending less, but also being more value conscious and trying to get more for their money as a result of the hurdle that they've gone over. None of these are likely to be particularly easy or decisions that customers would want to have to face into. But across all those dimensions, what we see is a population that's very financially engaged, and taking these decisions largely before getting into greater difficulty or greater financial struggles, which is, I think, a small piece of encouragement through how we've gone through that. So those are some reflections on what we see in terms of customer behaviour that's changing and adapting at the moment. One small bit of positivity coming from the business side. Last month, Scottish businesses were more optimistic about future growth than they have been at any point in the last 12 months. And hopefully that doesn't have a negative scale, unlike consumer confidence net positivity. They are expecting and are seeing growth, boosted by exports and strongly performing services sector. The other feature, which I think is very relevant to respondents to this survey, is that Scottish businesses are saying that the labour market is relatively strong as well. Scotland, as a nation and region of the UK, is second in ranking for staff retention and recruitment, according to businesses who are doing the recruiting. So hopefully that suggests that the Scottish labour market will be able to support greater activity and higher wages. But inflation isn't just something affecting the personal customers either. It's also top of businesses' mind. And they are reporting that whilst we may have the headline inflation down towards the Bank of England's target, there are still costs and pressures in the pipeline. And this doesn't feel like it's a story which has ended yet on that side. So hopefully some useful reflections. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Lots and lots of food for thought there. I'm just struck by what Sebastian said about the survey being averages. And I think within that, Scott, you pulled out some of them, but each number, sometimes there are some really stark contrasts in there. and I think there's still roughly is it about 20% at the bottom end where we see a difference from the resource bits that Sebastian mentioned, where people have got resources, and even if they're modest resources, they're able to draw on them to cope with harder economic times. But there are others in that survey that are still showing that they're increasing the amount of borrowing. And I think that's really hard for us to get through in media terms, that there isn't one thing that's happening. Right, over to the audience for questions. I know we've always got too many we can get through, so we will probably try and group them. And we have roughly 20 minutes, so please make them short and concise when you put them to the panel. So who wants to go first? Please don't be shy. David.
Yeah, going right back to the start of the findings about moving in the wrong direction, 62% up 4 points. So the worst finding, in a sense, the worst finding. Is it in any way, is that defined? And obviously, well, given the period we're in, and talk of turning the corner and so on and so forth, is there any sense of why people think it's doing that, and where do they apportion responsibility, given that we have two government, we live under two governments?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. So in terms of the first part of it, whether it's defined, the question is deliberately broad. So we kind of leave it to people's own interpretation of what they think might, be right or wrong direction. I think to follow on the sort of train of thought that you were on, I think if we see on the priorities that we see the same priorities are at the top of the priority list for quite a long time in a sustained period, the suggestion might be then that, people aren't seeing the action in those areas. So therefore people are thinking, well, okay, I'm still prioritising healthcare, I'm still prioritising the cost of living. I don't feel better off. I don't see waiting lists getting tackled. I don't feel like there's a serious alternative or route through that. And then that wrong direction keeps building. So I think what is interesting is in the period that we're in, does that prioritisation start to change, for example, and become a wee bit more kind of grouped together and less stark as that changes from sort of back into the right direction? So to kind of summarise the point, I think it's that persistence of the priorities, but I think people aren't feeling they're seeing the action there, and therefore that's pushing that figure kind of further towards the wrong direction. But it is deliberately broad, so people can leave it to their own interpretation.
Yeah, I think there's not much coming out of the campaigns so far that speaks to the top priorities, as far as I can see.
Thanks. Can I ask about the link between the labour market and growth and/or real incomes? Because standard economic theory might suggest that if you free up the labour market, the income growth will not take place, and people might end up still worse off than they were whenever the baseline is. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on the balance between the labour market and tightness of the labour market or not, on the one hand, and economic growth and income on the other.
Feel free to contribute. So, yeah, thank you. I'd start with the observation that whilst there is some uncertainty about lots of labour market statistics at the moment, I think everyone would agree that this is a relatively historically tight market. There are relatively few people who are in a position to work, want a job, and are unable to achieve one at the start point. Now, there are lots of people who aren't working who don't quite meet that criteria. And a big debate at the moment is around how many are inactive because of either a medical or an illness obstacle, or something else relating to their family situation. So governments have been very interested in childcare at the moment in an attempt to broaden access to the labour market through that way. The ramifications of that for the overall market conditions, I would say, it's a helpful, anything you can do to get waiting lists down or to allow greater labour market participation amongst those with caring responsibilities, particularly, but not always obviously, typically women, is helpful for the labour supply and will help make it easier for people to, businesses to fill the roles. But it's unlikely to tip the market into be so significant that it would tip the market into a downward trajectory and really hurt kind of the equilibrium level of wage that you would need to charge in any industry. And one of the reasons that's especially so at the moment is because whilst there are lots of other things going on in the migration statistics, it is true that we are seeing strong net migration amongst people of working age in order to fill roles that are effectively unable to be filled domestically. So that could be an escape valve for some of the pressure. You wouldn't need to, if you're able to recruit more locally, you wouldn't need to go internationally outside of the EU, which is where most of the increases come from, in order, to quite the same extent, in order to fill those sorts of roles. So yeah, I wouldn't have any concerns that greater supply would mean a lower price or lower wages as a result of that.
Can I ask you a question? You mentioned additional income in people's bank accounts from sort of side hustles or selling things. Or we asked a question, Scott, didn't we, about second jobs, but we haven't asked about side hustles. But I definitely see an increase. So it was really. I'm wondering, the number of people taking second jobs isn't enough probably to affect the labour market in terms of supply, is it? Or
we haven't observed a material shift in that behaviour, but largely as the technology makes it easier to monetize things that you've got, we do see an increasing behaviour around that, driven by both financial and sustainability kind of logics for it. So yeah, I think that is an increasing theme and trend which we'll see more people participating in the future.
I was just going to say that at the moment, I understand the concern about just yeah, but just the point that just it doesn't necessarily mean 100% of the time that's what's going to happen. I think at the moment, given that the level of service inflation as well is still pretty high, there's still points to wage growth actually being quite strong now. There was a big period at the beginning of the inflation crisis where wages weren't changing almost at all until the next year, and that's where the catch-up growth has happened since then. And we haven't yet hit, as I said, the level of growth relative to kind of mid 2021 to compensate for the growth in prices, but that is happening and that will happen. But obviously the Bank of England is trying to thread a very tight rope and trying to get prices growing at a slower rate, while at the same time not causing widespread disruption to the labour market as well.
I'm really mindful that the room is about 50-50 male-female, and we've had 3 questions from men so far. So I'm coming to you whether or not you've got your hand up soon.
I was intrigued by your productivity charts, and the eyes are naturally drawn to the high priority. I wonder whether that's actually where the levers need to be put. I think at the lower end of the priority spectrum, I found education, innovation, trade, productivity. Do you ever talk to any decision makers who actually pay attention to the low priorities?
Decision makers?
Yes. Presumably data are provided to not just us, to other people.
Yeah, well, so obviously the information is available. I think it's an interesting challenge to maybe take that out into the business sector and into the as you mentioned, decision makers and people like that to perhaps present these findings a bit more broadly than here. It's not conversations I've personally had, so I don't really have a a direct answer to that question, but it's certainly an interesting challenge about what we could do with the data more widely.
Before I get forced to ask a question, so and I hope this isn't too technical. I was interested to know how your top issues index compares to the UK-wide ones or the Scottish samples within that. Is there comparability? Is there any difference in what you find?
So they're reasonably consistent with UK level, with the kind of key difference being that we tend to find that UK level that immigration's a bit higher up in people's list of priorities as compared to Scotland. So if you look at figures that have come out in the last week or so, kind of in response to the election, health and the economy remains kind of the top priorities across Great Britain. Immigration tends to be a little bit higher Great Britain-wide than it does in Scotland. And there's also variations in terms of supporters of different parties. So if we look at, I'd written this down before I anticipated this question. If you look at all, healthcare, economy, immigration would be the top three in GB. If you look at Labour voters, it's health, economy and housing. And then if you look at past Conservative voters, it's immigration, health, economy. So you can see there's some slight differences there, and they kind of track with some of these, they track with the Scottish figures, with the exception that immigration tends to be lower down on people's priorities.
Another one to pick into Scott's figures, but inspired by Sebastian's comment about Marks and Spencers and Waitrose. You talked about demographic differences in age. Are we seeing a big sort of socioeconomic difference in people's attitude on cost of living? Because I'm sort of wondering do we now have better off people feeling the squeeze where maybe they weren't before?
Yeah, so I think the kind of lower SIMD would be the kind of metric that we use. And lower SIMD people are more likely to prioritise cost of living, more likely to report that their financial circumstances are worse than last year, and be slightly more negative in their outlook. There's other factors as well that play in. So having children, for example, households with children are more likely to say that they feel worse about their financial circumstances. I think what's interesting for us to keep our eye on in that going forward is actually, is that becoming more stark, or is that, because previously we would have had people even in quite high SIMD, in 4 and 5, saying, well, actually, yeah, we're feeling the squeeze or we're worse off. That's becoming less so the case now, but it still holds it. You've still got paying probably, I'm going to put a figure out here, I might not be nice, but kind of still a high proportion are still feeling worse off, or still negative looking out, but it is more sharp in the lower SIMDs you'd expect, and households with children and younger people, and it's that, they're all interrelated, but there is a story there.
Hi, morning. Thanks so much for those presentations. Very interesting. You can hear from my accent, I form part of those net migration statistics that Sebastian was talking about. Sebastian, maybe just a question to you. It was interesting to hear that health and cost of living are the most important things for individuals. Sort of from your client base, what do you see are the top 2-3 issues for businesses in the current economic conditions?
So I think businesses are very interested in the direction of policy on areas that matter for them. And we have a lot of areas of the economy where that policy is really important, whether it's about access to labour, or the various transitions that economy and society are going through, in particular net zero, or where there's been big changes in, particularly post-Brexit, in how and where those rules get set. So agriculture being one I would tend to go to there most acutely. So I think that is something which is a recurring theme. The other feature which would typically be raised is skills and the mix of skills amongst particularly younger workforce. There's a lot of demand for people with the sort of technology-based skills to allow us to make the most of improvements in automation and AI being the latest kind of hot topic. But more broadly as well, businesses are typically asking for people to be readier to make a positive contribution in the workforce. And how that works then with various initiatives like apprenticeships to kind of help with that is something which continues to be top of their mind.
This is a question for Scott. We noticed in your presentation that there was a decline in people giving money to charities. Did you collect any data perhaps on those who might be thinking about leaving money later on in life, so sort of with in their will or gifts kind of in their future sort of financial situations?
And on that point, that figure kind of, as I mentioned, it kind of has been up and down over the last year, interestingly. We don't collect that data directly about people making plans for that. We just have that kind of broad reduced donations to charity. But it is an interesting point to maybe think about how we distinguish between those two different types of giving. So, okay.
I think we've got the balance right again. Excuse me. We're in the middle of a general election campaign. Given the figures and the trends that you've shared with us this morning, what one piece of specific advice would you each give to the parties and their leaders as they seek our votes at this time?
The focus on health is to such an extent and has grown so much over the last few years that I think it's really important that that parties and prospective candidates understand and show that they grasp the seriousness of the problem, and for the both on the financial side and on the kind of health management side, that they show that they understand the scale of the problem and that they have a plan for getting the waiting list down. Because that clearly, I think, across Scotland and the UK is the number one concern that people have at the moment.
I think I would say something similar in the respect that, we see that healthcare and the cost of living are so ahead as issues in terms of prioritisation amongst people, that people simply want to hear that, and they want to hear what people's solutions are. So my advice would certainly be that you have to be talking about that. But there is always a tendency or an ease to think when you see a list of priorities that everyone should go after healthcare and the cost of living. But everybody has a voter base, right, that has different priorities and they look different within that. But what I would say about those figures is they certainly suggest that even if someone's priority might be the Constitution and someone else's might be education, healthcare and cost of living is probably one of their priorities too. So I'd certainly still be speaking to that as part of my campaigning.
I think the reflection I would give is that amongst the voter base and anyone's customer base, we see such a wide variety of people and businesses in facing different challenges and opportunities. So averages are brilliant, but underneath that lie a whole diversity which good policy needs to address.
So we've recently had a housing emergency declared in Scotland, but if I'm not mistaken, that wasn't one of the key issues that people identified, or at least it wasn't one of the top ones. So is there any sense as to why that might be, or is it getting wrapped into other things like cost of living, for example?
Housing's sitting at around 15%, and it consistently sat in that kind of group of, if we imagine you've got the two issues, healthcare and the cost of living up here, then there's this group of issues which is poverty and inequality, the economy, housing, education, schools. My kind of theory on that is that a lot of people picking healthcare and cost of living as their top two, and then one other. Housing is more likely to be identified by younger people as an issue. It's more likely to be identified by people in lower SEIMD as an issue. So again, it's not important to people. It's still 15% in their top three. It's kind of caught in amongst, I think, a group of important issues that are just seeing that touch being less prioritised right now than healthcare and the cost of living.
And the cost of housing.
Yeah.
You might very well wrap it into the cost of living, right? Like if your rent's increased or your mortgage has increased, then your cost of living has increased. So you might not feel like you have necessarily to say anything about that in addition.
Want to add anything, Sebastian? Okay. Right. Well, sadly, it comes to me to bring this event to a close so you can all get on with your days and take away all the food for thought we had this morning. What we didn't say, Scott, was the extra questions we added this time were part of a bigger piece of research that the David Hume Institute is doing on the Great Risk Transfer. So you may remember, those of you that have known us for a long time, we published a report about 18 months ago. We're doing a phase 2 of that. So we have additional questions in this survey. We have additional questions in the upcoming Understanding Business survey. And we've also done a load of interviews with individuals. And that report now, because of the election, will be coming out in August. So keep your eyes peeled for that. But we didn't want to hold back this data. We wanted you to have it so you can use it in your everyday lives as you go round about what your business is. So the other thing we've got coming up, our next event is on Monday. It's a live stream as part of the Economy in Plain English series, so please do join us for that. So sadly, that's the end of today. I'd really like to thank our speakers. I usually come to you for one last comment, and I say you've got a minute each, but I don't think we've got time for that today, unless you can summarise all your thoughts in one sentence. Do you think you can do that? No. Okay. Right. I love a straight answer. Thank you very much. Right. So we hope it's good to finish on a always good to finish with humour. So thank you very much. We hope you've enjoyed the discussion and you can use this in your lives. Particularly, I'm thinking of Andy over there in the corner. We really want to see this on your podcast, so we'll be listening out for that. For those of you who don't know, it's Holyrood Sources. I'll give it a plug, shall I? Thank you. That's okay. Please remember that the David Hume Institute is a charity and we can only continue to bring you free thought-provoking events through generous donations. Like today, we've been hosted by NatWest and the Royal Bank of Scotland. We really appreciate in-kind donations, but also we need your money too, like many charities. It's really, we can't operate without cash, so please do think about making a monthly donation. It really makes a difference if you become a friend of the David Hume Institute. That's it then. Thank you for joining us. We really look forward to seeing you again. The next one will be on the 28th of August, which we think will be going to Glasgow this time. So we're just in discussions over a free room in Glasgow. So if anyone can help with that, please do let us know. Yes, just one last thank you to you all in the usual way.